Good evening, everybody. It is now 7 o'clock Monday evening. My name is Andre, and of course, by now, I hope you know that my name is Andre Anderson. I am both host and founder of BSTL. What does BSTL stand for? It stands for Building Something That Lasts. And of course, if you are here for the very first time on this podcast, we talk about all things leadership based. And we just want to have these conversations that will help us to grow. I know I'm growing. I've had so many different guests on for the last year and a half, and what a journey it's been. I've been able to share and also receive, and I think I'm better off for it. And so this is part of the experience that we want you to have. This evening, of course, we have another guest. I'm so excited. He's all the way over on the, what does that make it, the East Coast in Nova Scotia. His name is Darren Ruck. Darren, are you there?
I am indeed. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I got you loud and clear.
Perfect.
Thank you.
To be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Thank you so much, Darren. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm sure you are a big deal in many different spaces, and I'm not sure that everybody has heard about you here on this podcast, and I want to give you a nice, big, gentle nudge and push. Why don't you just share a couple of things about yourself with our listeners?
Well, I think you mentioned that I am from Nova Scotia, born and raised.
Okay.
Split heritage. My father's side is from Barbados, actually.
Okay.
Second generation. My grandfather came here to Nova Scotia in around 1918. On my mom's side, I'm from descendants of the Black Loyalists. Now, those who don't know, should Google it, but Black Loyalists came here in the late 1700s as part of fought on the side of the British. So I've got a long-standing history here in Nova Scotia. Generational experiences, obviously, with racism and discrimination. But had a strong family.
Yeah.
And I think that's what led me to do what I've been able to achieve over the years.
All right. Does that make for one thing, or is that two things?
Oh, that could be one thing, or that could be several things. What else can I say? I'm a dad, and I like to golf, although I'm not very good at it. And I'm a studier of people. I've completed my MBA back in 2003, I think it was.
Okay.
But at that time, my real focus was on organizational behavior. Really, the focus on what makes people tick at work, what motivates them, and what keeps them engaged. So since that time, I've really been, in some ways, I'll say a leader. Obviously, have opportunities to lead, but also sitting on the bench and watching others lead. I think you learn a lot from others, from their leadership style, better or for worse, right? So, so that's where I'm at. And coming closer to retirement, I work for the federal government, the Public Service Procurement Canada.
Yeah.
I've been in the human resource field for much of my career. I also spent a long stint in the private sector. I was a recruiter and diversity person as well for the bank in Nova Scotia for many years before rejoining the federal public service. So yeah, my experience goes pretty broad.
Nice.
How many things is that, right?
No, that's good because, I think, Darren, one of the things that we try to do here is we really want to put a pulse on every person that comes onto the podcast on this platform because, sometimes in leadership, there's a little bit of a distance between quote unquote us and them. And at times, leaders are evaluated based on their job, what they do, and not always on who they are. So I'm glad that you've shared a bit and given us the balance on what it is that you do, not just on your work, but some of the other things that you've been doing throughout your lifetime. And so we celebrate your retirement that is coming soon, and we hope that you'll be able to do a whole lot more. And by the way, there was another gentleman, and I don't know, I'll just say his name anyways. His name is Ron Kelman. He is from Barbados as well. The last name of Kelman is such a unique name. Maybe he's somebody that you know.
That doesn't ring a bell.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not surprised. I think I listened to one of your podcasts when you had him on. He's a friend of yours, so
Yeah.
and I think he spoke a lot about the educational system in Barbados.
Yeah, that's
So,
right.
yeah. So that being said, I've always said that as well. I think in some ways you feel like you inherited that uh, that desire to have a solid education.
Yeah.
Particularly on my dad's side, again with being now third generation from Barbados. So interesting.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so today, we want to have this conversation, right? And
Hmm.
I'm glad that I now know about this MBA. It may come up in our conversation, but we want to talk a little bit about helping to lead people from where they are.
Hmm.
Versus maybe where we want them to get to. And I think that the dichotomy is important because sometimes as leaders, we have an expectation that may or may not be reasonable based on where we meet people as we lead them. So go ahead, lead us with this charge, this conversation.
Well, I'll go back to my studies theoretically, and one of the sort of the motivational theories out there is around the concept of where a person is at in terms of their maturity level, right?
Mm-hmm.
A new employee coming into the organization versus one that's been around for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about leaders needing to sort of understand and react and respond to the people around them, including their direct reports and their team members, being able to understand where they're at that in that moment and respond appropriately. The idea is to do no harm,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and which goes back to I think your earlier conversation about being empathetic or empathy
Mm-hmm.
and having empathy. So, as a leader, I think the first thing you have to understand is that level of responsibility you have and accountability
Mm-hmm.
to do no harm. So that means understanding that people are your greatest asset or your greatest resource,
Mm-hmm.
much more so than the computer that you use in front of you,
Right.
that you would not intentionally do any harm to.
Yes.
Right. So, one of the things I've often said is we seem like we put more effort on protecting our physical assets,
Mm-hmm.
our computers, our office space, and so on,
Yes.
versus protecting the people. And so putting that in place and putting people first
Yes.
above all else seems to me to be the most reasonable way of most integrity way of leading.
So I want to jump in and ask you a question then, and it's not that I disagree with you, Darren, but I'm thinking about this, and of course you are somebody that works with human resources. So I don't know if you're a part of the hiring and firing process, the training and development. I mean, you can respond in a few moments, but here's the struggle, maybe. So somebody is leading, but they don't necessarily get to choose who they lead. So of course there's this whole hiring process. The person makes it through first and second stages of the recruitment process, and now they're in your office. They have scored well, they have done well, they've answered well, but then they're now out there, whether in the cubicle, on the phone, whatever that looks like. And then you begin to realize, as their leader, perhaps the emotional intelligence on their end isn't necessarily there. And so there's this juggling act, perhaps, of how do you do no harm, but also get what needs to get done because there is a requirement. There is something that has to happen because that's the terms of the employment. What do we do in those situations?
Well, those situations are, they're performance management situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I say do no harm,
Okay.
what I mean by that is to not intentionally.
Okay.
If I have a conversation with an individual and I've had many of those kinds of conversations where they're just not maybe performing well at that time, maybe it's a training need.
Mm-hmm.
It's about having that honest conversation with that individual to let them know that
Mm-hmm.
You're there to support them.
Mm-hmm.
And B, there is a job to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we figure this out? How do we find that ground, that safe ground, that safe space where you're able to perform at a level that I know you want to be performing at?
Mm-hmm.
So what's needed, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that often is a coaching situation,
Mm-hmm.
right? So again, it's about meeting an employee where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
Often that also includes building a level of trust
Okay.
so that you're able to confirm where they're at and have an open conversation in a safe space. Maybe there's personal issues involved. Maybe they're going through a relationship issue at home, or having kids problems, or aging parent responsibilities. We're all individuals, right?
Yes.
And we all have our ups and downs,
Mm-hmm.
often described as, but we go, we're a body of emotion,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I think it's wrong for a leader simply to look at the performance and mark that employee as a bad employee,
Ah, okay.
right? I
Mm-hmm.
think that you have to discover the true underlying issues that are leading to that performance issue.
So, all right, then. So then maybe here's the follow-up question. Because I hear you saying that it's important that you get to know the employee beyond their performance. So what happens then if you are open, you have demonstrated that you are empathetic, you have proven to your team that you are for them, you are there to support them, but they don't necessarily share. And we know that there are a lot of employees that they have a hard line in the sand that says, this is my work and this is who I am after work. What happens when they don't share? And the only thing that you can go on is what you know, and ultimately what the performance is also showing and demonstrating. Where do you go from there? How do you get them to come out of the hole?
Well, I'm also a believer in there's an old theory of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And I'll answer your question, I think, more directly once I talk a little bit about that. But
Mm-hmm.
I believe that we all share some common needs.
Mm-hmm.
So those basic needs are around basic housing, security. You have to feel secure,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have to have food in the fridge. You have to
Mm-hmm.
have a roof over your head. As you go up this sort of pyramid, the needs turn more into relationship levels, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the need accepted, the need to feel uh, rewarded, for the work that you're doing. I
Mm-hmm.
believe in the highest percentage of cases, people want the same things.
Mm-hmm.
So they want to have some sense of that their job is meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if they're not getting that meaningfulness from their job, maybe they're in the wrong job.
Mm.
So you have to discover again. It all comes back to where they're at,
Right.
and you can there's a pyramid, or you can look at it from at the maturity level model.
Right.
But it all comes back to where they're at. And I think again, I say there's very few people that go to work wanting to do a bad job,
Right.
right?
Yes.
So if you accept that as a fact,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to then dig deeper into the reasons why the job is not getting done. Like, who wants to come to work and have their supervisor over their back every day
Mm-hmm.
so that they're not doing their job, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's illogical, right? In most cases, right? So,
Sure.
um, yeah, so it really comes down to where they're at and in discovering that, right? So I would argue that there are very few cases where people go to work wanting to do a bad job.
So then, Darren, maybe here's the next part to this question, possibly. Um, as we talk about development, we also do understand that as leaders lead, the entire team is not at the same stage, not just based on emotional intelligence, but where they are in the process of employment, right? So when I hear
Mm-hmm.
you say, I'm going to be retiring soon, right, at some point,
Right.
You are at a different stage of development. You're beginning maybe to shut things down. But on the other extreme, to the other end, is the individual that's just now coming out of college,
Right.
university, and
Right.
how they see leadership, or how they see the marketplace, the workplace, completely different. How
Yep.
do we find a way to lead both experiences?
The generational differences.
Correct. Yes.
Well, you know, I think you're quite right. I'll lean on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Coming out of university, anyway,
Mm-hmm.
it's been a lot of years, but I can still remember those days.
Mm-hmm.
That level of sense of security is not always there,
Mm-hmm.
right? If one doesn't feel secure in their job or in their possession, where they're at in life, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
if they're having a difficult time still paying the rent,
Mm-hmm.
those things can very easily flow over into your performance,
Sure.
right? Um, I think that you have to, new employees, as part of their orientation, they have to understand, I call it the business acronym of the organization that they're working in, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the prospects for promotion realistically? What do they need? What do they already possess that they can leverage? What do they need to develop in order to move forward?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think, universities, feed on student expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
if I have an MBA, well, I should be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company at some point, right?
Right.
In the next 5 years.
Right.
So, and that helps justify the high tuition fees too, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I think there's a mutual, feeding off one another. And so students sometimes do come up with very, very high expectations. And I think those expectations have to be tempered a little bit in many cases. But again, where that person is at, whether they're at a university or they've been 5 years in the job, their sense of security over that job is highly impacted by the leadership style of their direct manager or the
Yeah.
manager above. Right. So having the sense that you're wanted, that you're being rewarded and recognized for the work that you're doing, I think goes a long way.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So far, we've been talking about those that we lead. And I think normally that is the focal point. But then there's also us leading within ourselves. And really what I mean is that I think also back to, the example of the university student that has the MBA, they've scored well, they've paid a lot of money, and they have this expectation. Um, Very ambitious is the word that comes to my mind as they join any organization. They've got this
Mm-hmm.
non-rose colored view of what the marketplace is going to look like. And here you are, Darren, leading and training and coaching and developing. But at some point, you now realize that this person is doing more than just learning from you. In essence, they may come and get your job. So where is it in terms of how do we manage ourselves while leading others, especially when we may find ourselves not necessarily out of a job, but no longer in that situation or in that context because we've literally worked ourselves out of a job because now the one that we have trained has now taken our responsibility. What do we do with that? How do we lead us? How do we start with where we tick as well while focusing on others?
Well, if I would have to say that any leader should hope that they can develop an individual to be able to take over where they're at in their
Mm-hmm.
job. That means you've selected a good candidate. That means you've done some good coaching and some good training, and you've got someone who can take over it. It's part of succession planning as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the sense of knowledge transfer
Mm-hmm.
to the next generation, if you will, right? I think it's a key responsibility of any manager, any leader, to look forward, look past where their job now, and look for individuals that can step into your shoes in a future time. So again, I think it's part of a leader's responsibility. But there was a second part to your question. I'm not sure if I caught that.
So, well, maybe I missed it, but I want to push a little bit further now that you've talked about succession planning, right? So, how do we then explain what we normally see in most, or and maybe I shouldn't say most because I don't have the statistics today, but we know that it's almost commonplace that once some leaders get into a specific position, it's almost like they're there either until they get fired or they die or they retire. What's that all about? So if the goal is to lead in such a way and identify the next generation of leadership as we coach and as we teach and as they suck up the information from us, knowledge base and so on and so forth, why is the turnover rate so slow as it relates to leadership?
Well, it's a good question. I think you have to look at the context of the organization. So in a very large organization such as the one I'm in, there's plenty of opportunity to move up to what we describe as the executive cadre or the EX groups.
Mm-hmm.
I may be in that group myself,
mm-hmm.
And I may keep my job until I retire.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean I can't train someone to be my to stand along with me in another unit, another branch, and so you can certainly promote people to sit beside you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily replace you. In a smaller company, obviously, the opportunities are fewer,
mm-hmm.
right? We know statistically that the turnover rate of our executive group is lesser than the rest of our population.
Mm-hmm.
I think once one does get to a certain level, there's a natural tendency. There are fewer opportunities actually at that stage to move in a different direction, right? The higher you go in an organization.
Yeah.
So the people do tend to stay for longer periods of time in the same job. But again, openings do happen. People do retire. In a large organization, if you've got what it takes, you certainly can find opportunity.
So, as one who has worked for the federal government for quite some time, I want to put a question out there. I've never asked it before, so I don't know if it's been posed to you before. But I'm now asking a structural question.
Okay.
How do we create an ecosystem that supports more development of leadership? I mean, it's easy to say, sure, we can shadow people, we need to develop and all of that other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we talk about that stuff all the time, but whether or not it actually happens in praxis, I don't know that it does. And the reason why I say that is that we're often so reluctant to let people go, whether they move along or they retire or whatever. It would seem to me that even though we're saying that this coaching thing that should be an ongoing thing that's a part of succession planning, we should be comfortable to see people moving along, maybe at a faster rate. So what's slowing the process down then? Because I agree with you, by the way, Darren. I agree with you 100%. Like I remember my mom, she worked in the hospital setting, downtown Toronto for many years. When she retired, they were still calling her. Can you come back in and take some extra shifts? And I'm thinking to myself, fine. I mean, it allowed her to come and go, right? But at the same time, what about the next generation that now doesn't get that shift because my mom is there, or other nurses and doctors that refuse to hang it up because they've maybe come to the conclusion that no one can do it as good as me? That can't necessarily be true if we've been shadowing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know your mom's situation, but there are cases where, there really is a genuine talent shortage or labor for that specific skill set.
Mm-hmm.
So they do, tend to call people back who they know can do the job, right? So I think that happens in a lot of cases. if you look at an ecosystem, like you suggested, I think you start with, okay, where are the bottlenecks, right? Well, the bottleneck in most organizations is at the very senior level, right? Those individuals, not necessarily leaving or retiring tomorrow, creates that, that bottleneck, if you will. So on the bottom of the bottle, though, you've got a lot of ambitious individuals, and I think that's what you're describing. And then, so the question is to them, how do you get to the top of the bottle?
Right? Yeah.
Well, two things. I think one has to temper their expectations, I think realistically.
Okay.
But you got to do all the things that allow you to be noticed, right? Take on volunteer opportunities, volunteer to do extra work, however it works out. But be seen, be noticed, be on time, and do quality work, right? And I think those individuals do tend to stand out. They get opportunities for promotions and so on. In the federal government, one of the biggest barriers, and will continue to be the biggest barriers, is language. You have to be bilingual for most senior level jobs, or all senior level jobs now. So, an individual coming into the federal government, if, right out of the university, let's say, for example, if they're unilingual or French or English, I think that there has to be a realistic conversation with them that if you want to stay with the federal government, you want to move up, take some language training.
Yeah.
Start now, right? And put your efforts, your extra time into that. But, in terms of an ecosystem, I think most organizations have the semblance of an ecosystem, right? We have coaching regimes, we have talent management programs. Managers are expected to develop their employees. We have strong learning organizations as well, right? So lots of courses, that employees can, again, taking the initiative to do those kinds of things on your own. The systems are there. The products and tools are there to help you succeed.
So let me tell you what my struggle is in this conversation, and not even so much because I disagree with you. In my experience, as I look and I listen and I have conversations with leaders all over the place, here's what I think is also a hindrance to this upward mobility. And I agree with you, especially in Canada, where French is, a strong language that we still use from province to province. I get that part. Here's what I'm wanting to see more, and I don't know if it's unrealistic. It could be the catalyst leader in me. I want to see us developing leaders, but not leaders that are towing the line, right? So this idea of the bottleneck. You've got some people who are ambitious, but based on where they are in the process within the organization, they have some great ideas. And the great ideas that they have, they don't necessarily fit. So even though they're on time and they're doing their work and they're doing all of the other stuff that is required, the reality is that there isn't a space for their way of thinking and leading. And so because they don't fit the mold of the organization, the reality is you've now got somebody who was ambitious, they were on time, but they don't look like what we're looking for because they don't think the same way. What do we do with those? Because they're bilingual as well, right? They're bilingual, they've got the MBA.
Okay, I know where yeah. Well, you're delving into a different subject area now, and I'm glad you brought this up because it's about organizational culture, right? And the culture is created by the individuals, of course, but certainly senior management has a lot of influence over organizational culture. I've always been a proponent of what I describe as diversity of thought, which means that, if an organization truly wants to be innovative, we've got to be willing to take some risk and we've got to try things, right? So Google and Amazon, other private sector companies have done really well through this concept of diversity of thought, right? So I think the federal government is one continue to struggle with that. We're a very risk averse organization, and we have a very bureaucratic type of a culture, where people are expected to behave and respond in certain ways. What I would say, the advice I would give to someone who doesn't appear to feeling like they're swimming upstream, is to really look for a lane that path of least resistance for you. What that's moving on to a different department or a different organization or a different work, or finding an opportunity where your way of thinking really makes can make a difference. You're also raising the subject, I think, of this concept of leadership can happen at any level, right? So the idea that let's say I have a great idea, a good concept for a program or a tool, my ability to have that considered or implemented is really how well I'm connected with my manager or the senior leaders as well, right? So there are opportunities, I think, for people to have their say and to take a leadership role from the back row. So two things. I think the government still struggles with their culture. The culture is not necessarily inclusive of that concept around diversity of thought, allowing people to leverage their own lived experiences.
Right.
And there's a bias, I think, built in that that we're essentially expected to behave in a certain way. So I think we still struggle with that, and that's a lot of the work that we're doing now. I think is trying to engage employees and others through employee networks to really take a leadership role in helping to influence cultural change and making diversity of thought, if you will, the norm. Right? So, normalizing this concept of having a different way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's important, Darren, primarily because the world is shrinking, right? And especially during this pandemic, where Zoom came out like the king of communication as far as I'm concerned, right? Everybody had a Zoom account or a Teams account, either or, just a couple of companies were doing that. But, that opened up the marketplace, right? So even though we often talk about the globalization of the world, the reality is now it is not impossible to have a colleague that is working in Malaysia or Australia or, South Africa, whatever. Maybe 5 years ago, you might have been like, well, I got to get on a plane. But now all you've got to do is click a button and share the meeting code and the password, and you're in. And this idea or concept that you've now shared of diversity of thought or thinking, this becomes even more crucial. Because you have, we're talking about culture, organizational culture. Well, culture is culture. However you want to mince it up, dice it up. The reality is you're going to be engaging people that have never thought about things the way you do, not because they're antiquated, but because they come from a different worldview altogether. And so, as we talk about the government, if the government doesn't change as one who employs, and on some level, we could argue they lead the charge on what organizational leadership looks like, then that means it's got to be difficult in other spaces that don't have the same infrastructure, don't have the same HR depth of wealth of knowledge, and the list goes on. So, it's one of those things that I think about a lot because, you're closer now because you don't have to get on a plane.
Yeah, absolutely. The cultural competence piece, right?
Yeah.
I agree 100%. I see it as an opportunity. Our country is becoming more diverse every day, right? Through immigration and so on. And the government they become part of the talent pool, right? Our future talent pool.
Yeah.
Citizens that become permanent residents, right?
Yes.
And as they become part of our organization, I think there's a natural shift in culture almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a tipping point, right?
Yeah.
Whereby I think the culture culture is driven by its people.
That's right.
Right? So
Yeah.
as an organization becomes more diverse, so does the culture of the organization become more inclusive.
Correct. Yeah.
Right? And I think we're moving in that direction. I'm very positive, very optimistic that we will achieve a sense of cultural change just by having a more diverse culture within all ranks of our organization, right? So
yes.
We need more diversity at all levels of the organization, including our most senior leadership.
So, it's interesting, Darren, because I do want to give you the last word on this conversation. But based on something that you said, and I hope you'll come back again to be a guest on this podcast, I want to talk maybe next time with you about changing what it looks like in terms of the meeting, the boardroom, where we often kind of thrash through some of these ideas. It often happens in a very specific space, the manager's office, the executive suite, whatever that looks like. But maybe as we're talking about inclusion, right? And everybody's talking about inclusion. I'm wondering what does a meeting look like when you bring all of these minds from different places around the world, and for some people, and I'm thinking about the Caribbean culture, our boardroom in Jamaica. Let me just use that, and maybe there are some parallels to Barbados. It's under the tree. Some of the best conversations I've ever had in Jamaica with very bright minds. It has happened in the shade. But we often relegate a lot of things to the office, but that's a different conversation. But Darren, I'd love for you to give us maybe your takeaway from this conversation as we talk about meeting people where they are.
Well, it's great conversation, by the way, and thank you very much for the opportunity to have this chat. I think my biggest takeaway is that connecting some of our conversation around meeting people where they're at, but also understanding that diversity piece, that diversity of thought piece,
yes,
is a huge component of where people are at.
Yeah.
Right. You mentioned a couple of times emotional intelligence. I think that's one of the most sought after. It should be the most valuable tool or skill set that any leader has, and that really is about understanding people where they're at, but also understanding yourself of where you're at. That's self-regulating piece, right? So regulating one's own emotions and tapping into the emotions of others allows you to increase the conversation, if you will, and allow you to, great for coaching skills, great for simple building trust and building relationships. I think a lot of it comes down to relationship building as well. So, how I build a relationship with a group of diverse individuals can really make or break my leadership skills or my leadership.
Darren Ruck, incredible conversation. And like I said, even if it's not the conversation that we had before, or the one that I mentioned on the end, I really do hope to have you come back. And I think you're absolutely right. This emotional intelligence and this diversity of thinking, thought process, I think those things, along with the ability to be with people, whether they're in the tree or they're on the ground, we have to find a way as leaders, and sometimes easier said than done, because I think we're all navigating our own personal lives at the same time. But if we want to be great leaders and we want to empower and duplicate ourselves, we have to put in the same work in ourselves that we are hoping to see happen in others. To those of you that are listening, I know we went a little bit longer today than we normally do, but I think it was worth every moment of it, because Darren has definitely a wealth of knowledge, and so we want to say thank you. And for those of you that haven't done so, don't forget to like, subscribe, and or share this podcast with anybody that is thinking about and contemplating and doing leadership. And if you'd like to have a broader conversation about this, don't forget to email me at bstlinc21@gmail.com. And that way we can connect and figure out how we can have another conversation. Until next time, have a great day, and thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time. Take care for now. Bye.